The theme this month is kind of apropos because what this journey requires and has required of me is really getting in touch with my own vulnerability. And let me say, I have not always enjoyed it. But we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So our theme this year, as we've talked about, is this idea of living out loud, which is this idea of being our fully truest selves in this world, in this experience that we're having. And each month we have a theme, and this month our theme has been vulnerability. And we're going to look at that idea of vulnerability in the context of seeing and being seen. So seeing and being seen, one might say, is one of our greatest desires and at the same time one of our greatest challenges, right? We want to be seen, but it can be scary to be seen. And we want to see, but sometimes things get in the way, right? Our fears, our biases, our prejudices, all the things that happen to us in life can get in the way. So how do we do that? How do we step into seeing and being seen? Well, the clue is in the theme, right? So you guessed it, vulnerability, that's what we're going to talk about. So the risk of being vulnerable, which in turn opens the door to courage and to living a life from the heart and living out loud. So to begin, as I said, I'm not always very comfortable with vulnerability. And as I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about it, like, what is it about that word, right? Vulnerability means imminent danger, right? It means being in harm's way, whether emotionally or physically. So when something bothers me like this, I get curious. Why is this bothering me so much, this word? Is it just that I, like most people, don't like the idea of being vulnerable? And so yes, that's part of it. But I think that what I realized in thinking about it is that being vulnerable is not simply being willing to be present with feelings of discomfort or risk, but it also means realizing that there is a greater power that we can draw on to support us, to have courage, to take risks, and to live from the heart in alignment with our own spiritual and moral principles. So our goal this month has been to gain greater clarity about vulnerability and why it's important. And we've been exploring over the various talks some of the different elements of that path and how we can navigate it. It's really a key element not only of our own personal transformation, but it can also serve as a building block for creating community. And that's what we're all about here at Eckholm, is this idea of creating community. So as we look at this today through this lens, the idea of vulnerability, we want to think about how that can contribute to creating community. And we're going to end this month next week with looking at some additional steps to do that. So just an invitation to return next week to hear about the next chapter of how to do that. But today we're going to look at how authenticity and the sense of connection and belonging become more possible when we're really willing to be vulnerable and bring our whole selves to the experience of life. We're going to think about how vulnerability can be actualized. So Ernest Holmes, our founder, says this: "We believe in God, the living Spirit Almighty, one indestructible, absolute, and self-existent cause. This one manifests itself in and through all creation, but is not absorbed by its creation. The manifest universe is the body of God. It is the logical and necessary outcome of the infinite self-knowingness of God." And this is a statement in our Declaration of Principles. So Science of Mind teaches this universal principle of oneness. And this means, as this quote explains, that everything is God, or source, or cause, or universal energy, whatever it is that you call it, it is all one thing. So oneness, however, does not mean sameness, right? It is an understanding that the manifest world, we are each a unique configuration of that one, expressing itself as us. And unlike teachings that tend to separate the human from the spiritual, right, ours affirms there is never any separation, right? We are spiritual beings having a material and human experience right here and right now. And as such, every moment is spiritual, right? No matter how mundane, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how messy. And that means that our opportunity and our journey is also to realize that every decision that we make is a spiritual decision, whether they have immediate or obvious effects or effects that reveal themselves over time. When we're fully able to grasp this understanding, or in the process of grasping this understanding, we can more clearly recognize this truth about others as well. And it's in this recognition that we begin to see that power of choosing to be vulnerable, of fully being our truest selves as a way of nurturing and creating community, despite the risk of regret or disappointment. How many of you recognize this photo? A few hands. I was about 10 years old when this photograph was taken. It captures the moment when two American sprinters, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who respectively won the gold and bronze medals in the 200-meter dash at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, raised their fists on the medal podium. According to Smith, it was a cry for freedom and human rights. We had to be seen, he said, because we could not be heard. At the time, they were both students at San Jose State. They were both from humble origins. Smith was from a sharecropper family in California, in the Central Valley. I didn't even know there was cotton agriculture in California, but at that time there was. And Carlos was from New York City. They both went to college on athletic scholarships. And as students, they became involved in a campaign called the Olympic Project for Human Rights, founded by their sociology professor, Harry Edwards. And this campaign sought to bring attention to the oppression and racism experienced by African and African diaspora people around the world. So the campaign was really focused on a couple of things. One was to have South Africa and Rhodesia banned from the 1968 Olympics because at that time apartheid was still practiced there. And the other was to impel universities and professional sports to employ more Black coaches and staff. So they were actually successful, by they, I mean the whole project, not just these two individuals, in that goal of having South Africa and Rhodesia banned from the games, but less successful in making that case for addressing the disparities and inequities that were taking place in the United States at that time. And so at the medal ceremony, and you can't really see it very well in the picture, but they were wearing large badges for their project, the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And when the national anthem was played, they raised their fists to express their solidarity with global human rights. And the young man who won the silver medal, whose name was Peter Norman, he was an Australian sprinter, he stood as an ally with them and he also wore the badge. But their choice resulted in their expulsion from the Olympics and numerous and serious repercussions for them personally and professionally. So this weekend, it so happened that I saw the play, the 19th, at the Old Globe, which actually tells the story of what led up to this moment that you see illustrated in the photograph and what happened after it to the three young men. So I want to use that story today to explore this idea of seeing and being seen. So this kind of vulnerability that we're talking about involves the willingness to look at and reflect on ourselves and to exercise personal responsibility. It requires us to look at life from a variety of different angles and to understand how our thoughts, our actions, and our words impact everybody around us. What framework, old frameworks, ideas, beliefs, prejudices, biases are we all carrying around that get in the way of our seeing what other people are trying to say and do, and might be getting in the way of how other people see who we think we are. So we're called to an expanded awareness of our connection with others, with the whole of life, right? And that is the fundamental bedrock of our teaching. We are all one together in this whole of life. And to think about how intentionality, perspective taking, and personal reflection can serve to bolster a sense of connection and belonging. So 1968, a really pivotal moment in our country's history. Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. The Vietnam War was in full swing. And many people, and especially many young people, were inspired to want to address inequities and problems in our society, and in particular, the pervasive racism and ongoing legacy of slavery in our country. And this meant bearing witness to these wrongs where they occurred. Now, whether or not you believe that the Olympics or any other particular occasion or situation is appropriate place to bear this witness, they believed that by making this gesture, they were affirming the value of African Americans as equal citizens, not only good enough, not only worthy of winning races for their country, but also worthy of equal opportunity of life in their country. They recognized their own truth, their own value, and they affirmed it in a very public way on a very public stage, despite the risks that they knew that they were undertaking. Even before the race took place, they and other members of their group had received death threats. And in fact, their professor didn't go to Mexico City because of the death threats that he had received. And Smith and Carlos at the time believed that when they made this gesture, that other athletes would join them in this affirmation, and unfortunately that did not really turn out to be the case. Marianne Williamson says, "As we let our light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence actually liberates others." So seeing others does not mean seeing them as we would like them to be, or as we think they ought to be at some point in the future. Instead, it requires present moment eyes. I love this phrase, present moment eyes. It's so easy not to be in the present moment. So these eyes see not through the lens of judgment or comparison, but through awareness that just like us, every person is a unique expression of the one. The third athlete on the podium, Peter Norman, did not have a personal stake in this protest. As an Australian, he didn't have a personal or national connection to injustice in the United States. Yet he chose to stand as an ally with Smith and Carlos and to affirm his own spiritual values. He was raised in the Salvation Army community in Australia, and he believed deeply in the equality of all people. A journalist who interviewed the three of them wrote, "Smith and Carlos asked Norman if he believed in human rights, and he said he did. They asked him if he believed in God, and Norman said he believed strongly in God. Carlos said, we knew that what we were going to do was far greater than any athletic feat. But Norman said, I'll stand with you. Carlos said he expected to see fear in Norman's eyes, but instead he saw love. On the way to the medal ceremony, Norman saw the Olympic Project badge being worn by another U.S. athlete, and he asked him if he could wear it. And it was Norman who suggested that Smith and Carlos share the black gloves because Carlos had forgotten his at the Olympic Village. And that's why Smith has the glove on his right fist, and Carlos had the glove on his left fist. So when we begin to practice seeing others in this way, the result is the creation of communities and spaces where we're all invited to show up authentically, messiness and all. And that means we're called to recognize the challenges that vulnerability raises and to address them head on without downplaying or ignoring them or bypassing them. And through this, we create, I believe, a vibration for acceptance, for honor and respect. And that makes a space for courage. So the interesting thing about vulnerability, as Marianne Williamson says, is that when we allow ourselves to be seen, we invite others to do the same. But this isn't achieved by words alone. It also requires intentional action, which does not mean we're always going to get it right? We're messy, aren't we, as human beings? So that means that we might try, we might miss the mark, so then we try again. We're invited to listen, not waiting for the opportunity to fix things, not waiting to prove ourselves right. I admit sometimes I fall into that trap. But listening instead to understand and connect. Yes, you can look at sympathy to my husband. But when we begin to show up this way and to be present for others, that's when we really begin to see the power of vulnerability actualized. All of the athletes in this story suffered immediate repercussions for their actions. As I said, they were ejected, they were vilified and harassed. Smith and Carlos suffered family breakups, loss of military and professional opportunities. Their sports careers basically ultimately ended. They did not return to the Olympics in competition. And even the suicide of Carlos's wife was attributed in part to the stress of the continued death threats that continued for a long time after they came back from Mexico City. The vitriol that they experienced affected their own relationship, Smith and Carlos, and for many years they really could not talk to each other, even though, interestingly, they both connected. They continued to be connected to Norman over all of that time until his death in 2006. And he also experienced severe criticism when he returned from Australia. He also was not able to return to the Olympics, even though his time when he won the silver medal is still the record time for an athlete in his event from Oceania, right? That's still holding. So clearly an amazing talent, all of them. That was world record-breaking time in that event in 1968. So, yet years later, all of them have been recognized for their courage and their sacrifice by San Jose State, by the White House, by the International Olympic Committee. In 2008, Smith and Carlos received the Arthur Ashe Award for Courage, which is an award given for courage in the face of peril and a willingness to stand up for their beliefs. Norman received a posthumous apology from the Australian House of Representatives and an Order of Merit from the Australian Olympic Committee, honoring his efforts for human rights. And despite what he had suffered, Norman is said to have said that he had no regret for his choice on that day. He knew the risks, and yet he acted in accord with his values. Since then, documentaries have been made and plays written like the one that I saw this past weekend. And in fact, Smith and Carlos attended the performance last night at the Old Globe. Right? These have been seen by thousands of people. Their willingness to be vulnerable, to act with courage still resonates with many people today. It's like a stone that's dropped into the water, whose reverberations continue, even often invisible, but still powerful over time. Brené Brown says, we cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known, when we honor the spiritual connection that grows from offering with trust, respect, kindness, and affection. Yeah. Let me just read that one more time. We cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known, and when we honor the spiritual connection that grows from that offering with trust, respect, kindness, and affection. So as we come to a conclusion, I want to affirm that vulnerability is not a one-dimensional concept. It requires both awareness, practice, and reflection. Just like with any new concept or activity, it requires continuing practice and then more practice. Really annoying in life, isn't that? This practice thing. We're called to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, to recognize the value of vulnerability, and to begin to create this space. And this requires looking at ourselves and others from an expanded view, seeing connection. While most of us will not be called to exercise vulnerability on such a public stage or scale, we are all called to bring our whole true selves to life. This week, I want to invite you to think of a story or a belief from your past when you didn't show yourself or stand in your truth that maybe you've been reluctant to think about or even a little ashamed of to share. How has this belief or story impacted your view of yourself and others? I want to invite you with self-compassion and gentleness to take some time to explore this story. Perhaps journal about it or share it with someone you trust. Or find a licensed religious science practitioner. We have a great group of them here whom you can trust, and schedule a session to take a closer look at that story or experience. We want you to know that Eckholm is a safe place where you can see and be seen. Reverend Jane Beach posted this week, and it was very timely, I thought. O infinite love, hold us in your grace. Help us remember we are love, peace, compassion, and wisdom. Help us look with clear eyes when we can't see past the murkiness of life. Give us the willingness and courage to be who we are with steadfast belief in love. Remind us that where there is darkness, we are the light. So, remembering that the light within us is always available to guide us, I invite you to join me in this affirmation. Please stand. Okay. So we're going to say it 3 times the way we like to do it here. So softly, with conviction, and then proclaiming it. All right? So, I allow myself, the divine within, to see and be seen. I allow myself, the divine within, to see and be seen. I allow myself, the divine within, to see and be seen. And so it is. Thank you.